Do you know that the most catastrophic economic collapse in modern history was not caused by the stock market crash alone, but by the decisions made in the months and years that followed? On October 29, 1929, the New York Stock Exchange lost 14% of its value in a single day. Billions of dollars of paper wealth evaporated before noon. Men who had been millionaires that morning were not by evening. The newspapers called it Black Tuesday, and they assumed, as did almost everyone, that it was the worst day of a crisis that would soon be over. They were wrong. The Great Depression lasted 13 years. It did not end because the economy naturally recovered. It did not end because markets corrected themselves. It ended because the United States entered World War II and spent money on a scale that finally overwhelmed the deflationary spiral that had been grinding the country down since 1929. What turned a bad stock market crash into the worst economic catastrophe in modern history? That is the question this video answers. Not the simplified version you may have heard. Not the cartoon of breadlines and falling stock tickers, but the actual mechanisms. The Federal Reserve that made everything dramatically worse. The gold standard that strangled recovery across every country that held to it. The bank runs that destroyed the savings of ordinary families who had nothing to do with Wall Street. The Smoot-Hawley tariffs that collapsed global trade. The Hoover administration's insistence on austerity at the precise moment that stimulus was needed. And finally, the Roosevelt reforms that began, slowly, imperfectly, controversially, to reverse the damage. Understanding the Great Depression is not an academic exercise. It is a manual for recognizing the warning signs that precede economic catastrophe, and for understanding what governments can and cannot do when the system begins to fail. The 1920s in America were genuinely extraordinary. Between 1922 and 1929, the stock market rose by nearly 500%. Agricultural mechanization had transformed the countryside. Mass production had made consumer goods affordable for the first time. The radio, the automobile, the refrigerator, these were not luxuries for the rich. They were becoming ordinary. A new middle class was emerging. And for millions of Americans, the stock market was the fastest route to participating in this new prosperity. The problem was leverage. The practice of buying stocks on margin, paying only 10% of a stock's price and borrowing the rest from a broker, had become standard. This meant that a 10% decline in a stock's value could wipe out a buyer's entire investment. And it meant that when stocks began to fall, brokers would issue margin calls, demands for more cash immediately, which forced investors to sell other stocks to raise the money, which pushed those stocks down further, which triggered more margin calls. By the late 1920s, the market had become a machine for amplifying both gains and losses. When it went up, people made fortunes quickly. When it went down, even a moderate decline would trigger a cascade of forced selling that could accelerate the fall far beyond what any fundamentals justified. There were also deep structural problems in the underlying economy that the bull market of the 1920s had concealed. Agriculture had never fully recovered from the deflation that followed World War I. Farmers across the Midwest and South were already deeply in debt by 1929. The European economies were fragile. Germany was paying reparations that it could only afford with American loans, which meant that if those American loans stopped, as they would after the crash, Germany's economy would collapse. And because the world was on the gold standard, that collapse would spread. The first sign that something was wrong came in late September 1929. Stock prices began to fall, not catastrophically, not in a single dramatic moment, but steadily and then with increasing speed. On October 24th, Black Thursday, nearly 13 million shares were traded. Prices fell so fast that trading floors could not process the volume. Tickers ran hours behind. No one knew what their holdings were worth. A group of the most powerful bankers in New York, led by J.P. Morgan and Company, attempted to stabilize the market by buying large blocks of stock at above market prices. It worked for exactly 2 days. On October 28th and October 29th, the selling resumed at a scale the bankers could not contain. On Black Tuesday, October 29th, the Dow Jones Industrial Average fell nearly 12%. Volume exceeded 16 million shares, a record that would not be broken for 40 years. The crash itself, however, did not cause the Great Depression. This is the critical point that most people miss. Stock market crashes are not uncommon. There had been a crash in 1921, a severe one, and the economy had recovered within 18 months. Stock market crashes normally cause recessions, painful, damaging, but recoverable. What converted the crash of 1929 into the Great Depression was a series of catastrophic policy decisions made by the Federal Reserve in the months and years that followed. The Federal Reserve had been created in 1913 specifically to prevent financial panics. It was designed to act as a lender of last resort, to pump money into the banking system when credit dried up, to prevent the deflationary spirals that had periodically destroyed the American economy in the 19th century. In 1929, it failed to do its job. In fact, it did the opposite. In the months following the crash, as deflation began to take hold, as prices fell, as businesses cut wages, as consumers spent less, the Federal Reserve tightened monetary policy. It raised interest rates. It allowed the money supply to contract. It watched as banks failed across the country and did not intervene. The Federal Reserve's inaction has been studied exhaustively in the decades since. The economists Milton Friedman and Anna Schwartz, in their landmark 1963 study, A Monetary History of the United States, argued that the Fed's failure to act was the single greatest cause of the Depression's severity. By allowing the money supply to fall by roughly a third between 1929 and 1933, the Federal Reserve turned a recession into a catastrophe. Why did the Fed act this way? The most persuasive explanation is the gold standard constraint. Under the gold standard, the United States was required to hold gold reserves equal to 40% of the money in circulation. When the crash triggered gold outflows, as foreign investors converted their dollars to gold and shipped it home, the Fed's ability to expand the money supply was severely restricted. If it created too much money, it would exhaust its gold reserves, be forced off the gold standard, and trigger an even greater crisis of confidence. The gold standard was a cage, and inside the cage, the Fed made the worst possible decisions. The bank runs began in 1930. They spread the Depression from Wall Street to Main Street in a way that no stock market decline ever could have. The American banking system in 1929 consisted of thousands of small, independent, unregulated banks, over 25,000 of them. Most had no deposit insurance. When rumors began to spread that a bank was in trouble, which was enough, in the absence of deposit insurance, to make the rumor true, depositors rushed to withdraw their savings before the bank ran out of cash. A bank run is self-fulfilling. Even a perfectly solvent bank cannot survive a run if enough depositors try to withdraw simultaneously, because banks lend out most of the money they take in deposit. The rush to withdraw creates the very insolvency it was responding to. In the winter of 1930, a series of bank failures in the agricultural states of the South and Midwest triggered runs that spread from county to county. Over the next 3 years, more than 9,000 American banks would fail. 9,000. When a bank failed, every dollar in every account above the amount the bank could liquidate simply ceased to exist. Depositors, ordinary working families who had nothing to do with the stock market, lost everything they had saved. The destruction of savings was not the only consequence of bank failures. The collapse of the banking system meant the collapse of credit. Businesses that needed to borrow to make payroll, to buy inventory, to invest in equipment, found credit unavailable. They cut production. They laid off workers. Workers with no income cut their spending. Businesses cut production further. The deflationary spiral accelerated. By 1932, American industrial production had fallen by nearly half from its 1929 peak. Unemployment had risen to 25%, 1 in 4 American workers. In some industrial cities, it was higher than 40%. Wages for those still employed had fallen by 40%. Farm prices had collapsed. A bushel of corn that had sold for 45 cents in 1929 was worth 8 cents in 1932. The human cost was not abstract. Hoovervilles, the name given to the shantytowns that appeared on the edges of every major American city, were named after President Herbert Hoover with unambiguous contempt. Families evicted from their homes built structures from cardboard, corrugated iron, and scavenged lumber. In New York City, men slept on park benches and in doorways. In Chicago, families ate from restaurant garbage cans. Bread lines stretched for blocks. Soup kitchens, run by private charities because the federal government provided almost no direct relief, served millions of meals a day. In 1932, the American Red Cross reported that families in the coal mining regions of West Virginia were surviving on dandelions and blackberries because there was no food. The Dust Bowl compounded the agricultural catastrophe. Decades of over-farming the Great Plains had destroyed the natural ground cover. When a drought struck the southern plains in the early 1930s, the topsoil, no longer anchored by roots, simply blew away. Dust storms 1.5 miles high rolled across Kansas, Oklahoma, Colorado, and Texas. Farms that families had worked for generations became desert. 3.5 million people, the Okies, as they were called, though they came from many states, abandoned their land and migrated west, mostly to California, where they found conditions almost as bad. The Depression did not reach its lowest point until the winter of 1932 to 1933. By that point, the banking system had nearly ceased to function. Governors in several states had declared bank holidays, closing all banks by executive order to stop the runs. When Franklin Roosevelt was inaugurated on March 4, 1933, he declared a national bank holiday on his first day in office. For a week, every bank in the country was closed. Herbert Hoover, who had been elected in 1928 on a promise of continued prosperity, watched the Depression deepen with a philosophy that made it worse. Hoover believed, sincerely, not cynically, that the federal government should not provide direct relief to individuals. This was not cruelty, it was an ideology. That private charity was the proper mechanism for helping the poor, that government handouts would destroy the recipient's self-reliance, and that balancing the federal budget during a downturn was essential to restore business confidence. Every one of these beliefs was wrong, and the evidence accumulated daily. But Hoover held to them. The Revenue Act of 1932, passed with Hoover's support, raised the top marginal income tax rate from 25% to 63% and raised taxes broadly across the income spectrum. In the middle of the worst depression in history, the government raised taxes. This reduced consumer spending at the moment that demand needed to be stimulated, deepening the deflation. The Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of 1930, passed in June of that year, before the Depression had fully developed, was perhaps the single most destructive legislative act of the crisis. Designed to protect American farmers and manufacturers from foreign competition, it raised tariffs on over 20,000 imported goods to record levels. America's trading partners retaliated immediately. Canada raised tariffs on American goods. Britain established an imperial preference system that excluded American exports. Germany, already struggling to service its reparations debt, saw its export markets collapse. Global trade fell by 66% between 1929 and 1934. The Smoot-Hawley tariff did not cause the Great Depression. It did not even cause the stock market crash. The Dow had already fallen significantly before the act was signed into law. But it accelerated and deepened the Depression by collapsing the international trade that American farmers and manufacturers depended on. The economists who warned Hoover against signing it, over 1,000 of them signed a letter begging him not to, were ignored. Franklin Roosevelt won the election of 1932 by the largest electoral margin since James Monroe ran unopposed. He carried 42 of 48 states. He promised a New Deal. He was not specific about what that meant, and the country desperate for anything different from Hoover, gave him a mandate. Roosevelt's first 100 days were genuinely extraordinary. The Emergency Banking Act, passed within days of his inauguration, gave the Treasury the authority to regulate banking and allowed the Federal Reserve to issue emergency currency. The bank holiday worked. When banks reopened under federal supervision, the runs stopped. Roosevelt went on the radio that night, a fireside chat heard by tens of millions, and told Americans that it was now safe to put their money back. They believed him. Deposits returned. The Glass-Steagall Act separated commercial banking from investment banking and created the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, which guaranteed deposits up to $2,500. This was the reform that actually ended bank runs as a systemic threat. If depositors knew their money was insured, they had no reason to panic. The Agricultural Adjustment Act paid farmers to reduce production, to leave fields unplanted and livestock unraised, in order to drive up prices. It was controversial. Destroying food to raise prices while people were starving was morally difficult. But it worked in the narrow sense that farm prices did begin to recover. The National Recovery Administration attempted to stabilize industrial prices and set minimum wages through industry codes. The Supreme Court eventually struck it down as unconstitutional. The Tennessee Valley Authority built dams and generated electricity across the rural South. The Civilian Conservation Corps put 3 million young men to work planting trees and building parks. The Public Works Administration built bridges, schools, and post offices. Roosevelt was not an economist. He did not have a coherent theory of how to end the Depression. He tried things, some of which worked, some of which did not, and he abandoned the ones that failed. He was pragmatic where Hoover had been ideological. But even Roosevelt was not willing to spend at the scale that Keynesian economics, just then being articulated by John Maynard Keynes in the General Theory, published in 1936, would have required. Keynes argued that the government needed to act as the spender of last resort when the private sector would not. The Depression persisted because aggregate demand was insufficient. The only entity large enough to replace that missing demand was the federal government. Roosevelt partially accepted this logic but remained reluctant to run large deficits. In 1937, persuaded that the economy had recovered sufficiently, he cut government spending and tightened monetary policy. The economy immediately fell back into recession, the Roosevelt recession of 1937 to 1938. Unemployment, which had fallen from 25% to 14%, shot back up to 19%. The lesson was clear. The recovery was entirely dependent on government spending. Remove the spending, and the economy collapsed again. The gold standard, meanwhile, was strangling every country that clung to it. Great Britain had returned to the gold standard in 1925 at the pre-war exchange rate, a decision that Winston Churchill, as Chancellor of the Exchequer, later called the greatest mistake of his life. The overvalued pound made British exports uncompetitive and kept British interest rates high. When the Depression hit, Britain was forced off gold in 1931. Paradoxically, that was the beginning of British recovery. Free from the gold constraint, the Bank of England could lower interest rates and the economy began to stabilize. Country after country told the same story. Those that left the gold standard earliest recovered earliest. Those that clung to it, France held on until 1936, suffered the longest. The gold standard was not a guarantee of financial stability. It was a mechanism for transmitting deflation across borders and preventing the monetary policy responses that could have ended the crisis much sooner. The United States went off the gold standard domestically in 1933, when Roosevelt signed an executive order requiring Americans to surrender their gold coins and gold certificates to the Federal Reserve in exchange for paper dollars. The Gold Reserve Act of 1934 then devalued the dollar against gold from $20.67 per troy ounce to $35, effectively a 40% devaluation. This gave the United States the monetary flexibility it needed to expand the money supply. But recovery remained painfully slow. In 1939, 10 years after Black Tuesday, unemployment was still 15%. The New Deal had prevented total collapse. It had provided relief, reformed the financial system, and built the infrastructure that would serve America for decades. But it had not ended the Depression. What ended the Great Depression was the Second World War. When war began in Europe in 1939, American factories began producing armaments for Britain and France under the Lend-Lease program. When Japan attacked Pearl Harbor in December 1941 and America entered the war directly, the scale of government spending became extraordinary. Federal expenditure, which had been $8 billion in 1939, reached $93 billion by 1945. Unemployment fell from 14% in 1940 to 1% by 1944. Every factory ran at full capacity. Every worker who wanted a job had one. Millions of women entered the workforce for the first time. The economy grew by 75% in real terms between 1940 and 1945. The war accomplished what 12 years of private sector adjustment and New Deal reform could not. It created sufficient demand to absorb the entire labor force and industrial capacity of the world's largest economy. The lesson, articulated most clearly by John Maynard Keynes but visible in the data for anyone willing to look, was that the Great Depression persisted not because recovery was impossible, but because the level of aggregate demand needed to produce full employment was politically unachievable in peacetime. Only the overriding moral imperative of war made the necessary scale of government spending acceptable. The legacy of the Great Depression reshaped American society, politics, and economics in ways that persisted for generations. The New Deal programs created the framework of the American welfare state: Social Security, unemployment insurance, federal bank deposit insurance, the Securities and Exchange Commission, the regulation of financial markets. These were not socialist experiments. They were conservative reforms designed to save capitalism from its own tendency toward catastrophic failure. The memory of the Depression shaped the generation that lived through it. Americans who grew up in the 1930s, the generation that would come to be called the greatest generation, carried the experience in their spending habits, their attitudes toward debt, their compulsion to save. Tom Brokaw, who wrote the book that gave them their name, described them as people who understood instinctively that prosperity was not guaranteed and could vanish without warning. The economic theory that emerged from the Depression, Keynesian economics, argued that market economies are not self-correcting, that recessions can become self-reinforcing spirals, that the government has a responsibility to stabilize aggregate demand when the private sector cannot. This was the dominant framework of Western economic policy from 1945 to 1980, and the prosperity of those decades, the fastest economic growth in modern history, was partly its product. When that consensus broke down in the 1980s, when supply-side economics and monetarism replaced Keynesianism as the dominant orthodoxy, the lessons of the Depression began to fade from institutional memory. The financial deregulation of the 1990s and 2000s recreated conditions, leverage, interconnection, concentrated risk, that bore a disturbing resemblance to the late 1920s. When the 2008 financial crisis hit, the first instinct of policymakers in several countries was the same as Hoover's: austerity, balanced budgets, letting markets correct. The result was the Great Recession, the worst economic contraction since the 1930s. Countries that rejected austerity and spent, the United States under Obama, Germany for a brief window, recovered faster. Countries that imposed severe austerity, Greece, Portugal, Spain, Ireland, experienced years of unemployment comparable in some metrics to the 1930s. The Great Depression is not ancient history. It is a reference point that recurs whenever the financial system is under stress, whenever governments face the choice between expansion and austerity, whenever the question of what central banks are for becomes politically urgent. The answer to that question, written in the suffering of 30 million unemployed people across a decade and a half, is not ambiguous. Central banks exist to prevent deflationary spirals. Governments have a responsibility to act as stabilizers when private demand collapses. The gold standard, or any system that constrains monetary policy in the name of an abstract standard of value, is a mechanism for converting recessions into catastrophes. Whether each successive generation is willing to act on those lessons is a different question. But the lessons themselves are not complicated. They are written in 13 years of breadlines, bank failures, Hoovervilles, and Dust Bowl migrations. They cost 30 million Americans and hundreds of millions of people around the world, more than anyone should ever have to pay for a lesson in economics.